Well, folks, it's 2023, and you know what that means in YouTube land? It's time for a roadmap video. First of all, I've got a little gripe with these sorts of videos. I don't feel they should or need to be made every year. I feel like it's just a little bit of a trend at this point. The process for beginner developers is largely the same, sort of year on year. Changes over the long term, maybe a little bit, like sort of every 5 to 10 years, but I think if you go back and watch a roadmap video from 2022, you'll be fine, I think. But nonetheless, if you can't beat them, join them, right? So here I am. Here's what I think you should be learning in 2023 to become a job-ready software developer. So first of all, you're going to need something to write code in, preferably not Notepad. That would be a masochistic experience at best, so don't do that. You're going to want something like Visual Studio Code or VS Code. That is the text editor for coding that I use and what most devs use, I feel like, these days. It's very popular commercially as well, so you'll likely use it in a job. But there's tons of other text editors out there as well. It's just really personal preference. You could also use something like a sort of an IDE, like a fully fledged integrated development environment for something like, say if you're writing Python, you've got PyCharm, which is one of the better options for that. I would say that would be a better experience than using VS Code for Python. Again, it's personal preference, but there's just a lot of built-in sort of functionality that benefits Python development, basically. You've got similar things for other languages as well. You've got IntelliJ for Java as well. The languages have all got their specific IDEs as well that are good for them. But VS Code's a good all-rounder, and that's what I use for my projects and for my work as well. So yeah, to make things easy for yourself, going in, learning the basics, probably just go with VS Code, to be honest. But yeah, entirely up to yourself. And then once you've got that figured out, you've got the basics down, how to navigate your way through your IDE or text editor of choice, then move on to the next part. So the first sort of section of things you're probably going to want to learn as a developer, there's like a few things in parallel, I would say, to look at. First of all, HTML, CSS. Even if you're not going to necessarily be a front-end dev, it's helpful to know. But if you are going to be a front-end dev, whether you've decided you are going to be or not at this point, it's very useful to know then. It's going to be useful anyway for you to understand what that is. HTML is obviously your hypertext markup language. It's what all web pages use as a template. You're going to want to know how that works and how to read it, how to understand it, how to write it. It's probably the easiest thing you can learn first, one of the most important, but also it's a good way to get your foot in the door and kind of get started. It's quite easy to understand. It's not really programming in itself, it's just programming adjacent and also very relevant to programming, obviously, because it is needed for websites and web pages and things. So if you're going to be a web developer especially, you will obviously for sure come across HTML. So yeah, learn that, and CSS as well, which is the styling language that we use for styling web pages as well. Those kind of go hand in hand, really. So HTML and CSS, learn that. At the same time, learn Git, which is a version control system that basically everyone uses for every project ever at this point. There's different places you can sort of upload that version code to. GitHub's a popular one, but there's other ones like GitLab and Bitbucket and stuff. But to dial it back a little bit, a version control system, if you don't know, it's just sort of a way to save different versions of your code at the same time. Separate it out into branches, basically, which makes it very useful for not only backing up your changes, but also working on things at the same time as other people. It's good for collaborating on projects with multiple people, so you can work on different branches, different versions of the code, so that your changes don't like conflict with each other and things like that when you try and all merge it together. Now, merge conflicts do still happen, and that is a pain. But using something like a version control system like Git kind of mitigates that stuff for the most part if you know how to use it. And it's just it's a safe option for backing up your code, and when changes don't go well, you can always just roll it back and stuff. And it's sort of the common practice in the industry now to use version control. So it is absolutely essential that you know how to use Git. And alongside that as well, you're probably going to want to get familiar with the command line as well. Learn command line commands, shortcuts and things, how to navigate through directories and move stuff, delete stuff, etc. through the command line. It will prove to be useful and a lot more efficient time-wise when you get used to it. It's good to learn just generally how the command line works as well for debugging and improving your overall understanding of how computers and the operating system that you're on works as well. So yeah, learn that as well. Any other sort of computer shortcuts as well is handy for speed. Another good one as well, just to throw it in, is typing. If you're not particularly fast at typing, or your technique's not particularly good, like you don't use all your fingers to type and things, you just kind of move the one finger around and stuff like that, it's quite important to sort of get better at that, mainly because not just for speed but also just for health. You might sort of cause injury to your hands and things prematurely if you're maybe like relying on one finger to type, for example. It's much less stress on your hands, your wrists and things like that if you sort of position your hands in a way where they don't have to move much, basically, and just sort of assign them to sort of an area of keys and type away without moving your actual hands and wrists too much. Touch typing, look that up. It's definitely helped me. I'm not particularly great at it, but I do try and stick to it. It is a lot better for your hands if you do it, and it's a lot more comfortable once you actually get used to it as well. It'll improve your speed as well. You can type much faster doing that as well. So yeah, throw some typing practice in there as well. So at this point, I would say you're finally ready to jump into programming now. Let's say you pick JavaScript, for example. If you're going to be a web dev, chances are that's what you picked. You might have picked like Python or Java or something like that, but same goes really. So you want to jump into the basic fundamentals of that. Various resources in which you can do that, whether it be video tutorials on YouTube or Udemy or whatever. I would recommend some interactive sort of courses as well, like Free Code Camp. There's tons of like interactive lessons and things you can do on that. Learn the stuff from video tutorials and various other resources. But what you should try and do eventually is take that knowledge and try and build something with it that isn't being described to you in a tutorial, and try and do that as regularly as you can. I realize that might not be the easiest task to try and sort of do when you have no knowledge at this point of how to do that, but as soon as you get some sort of inkling as to how you can actually make like a web page, for example, that does something with maybe JavaScript, then try it. Just try it, and chances are it won't work the first time, and that's fine. Fail to succeed. That's kind of how this stuff works. Just trial and error. Learn by failing first, and sort of it gives you early exposure to debugging and errors and reading error codes and things like that. That stuff's all very, very important, especially for when you're actually in work. So yeah, build projects, but obviously you'll need some knowledge before you can do that. So your usual resources like your video tutorials and interactive lessons, wherever you go for those. Learn the basic fundamentals of the language that you've chosen through that. And when I say basic fundamentals, I mean sort of everything up to like object-oriented programming, I would say. There's other advanced concepts and things you can learn, like regular expressions and stuff like that, but like for just learning the basics, try and focus on the basics and hone in on that. Try and sort of retain that and understand it, because you're not gonna, chances are you're not gonna the first time you go through it. So repeat stuff, look at stuff over and over again, build stuff using the things you've learned maybe a couple of times. You're gonna be stuck on this for a couple of months maybe if you're doing this entirely self-taught, and that's fine. That doesn't mean you're slow. That is normal. That's it's not an easy thing. Learning to program, it's quite difficult, believe it or not. So yeah, give yourself time basically to really grasp this stuff, and don't hold it against yourself for taking longer than a few weeks. But anyway, eventually, a few months in, you'll hopefully have sort of the basics down of a language. Maybe at this point you haven't quite figured out how to build a proper project, like a full stack app that has like a back end and stuff like that. Something that's not just a web page with some JavaScript nonsense going on. Well, I'd say at this point that's maybe next. So fortunately for us JavaScript enjoyers, it does basically everything that you need it to do these days when it comes to web development. So yes, traditionally it's a front-end language. It was a language built for the web browser. It's what the web browser uses. Fortunately for us, you can run it server-side now as well. There's a handy little runtime called Node.js. Node.js is what you will use if you want to create your backend with JavaScript as well, because that means you can run JavaScript server-side. And what you want to do with that is create maybe like a little server to host some kind of data on, which your front end will then retrieve and then display somehow or do something with. So Node.js, you'll probably want to learn that and how to use that. A library like Express.js as well. Express is a handy little library for creating like small servers to run, and that uses Node to do that. So you want Express if you want to create like a server, if you want to create like your own sort of little API, for example. And to install any of these sort of dependencies that you might need for your project, like Express, you'll need a package manager. So Node Package Manager, or NPM, is one of the most popular package managers for JavaScript and very much worth learning. So learn NPM as well. And yeah, at that point, you know, you can basically build a full stack app. You maybe need a database as well, potentially. But you could theoretically build something without learning any database stuff. If you wanted the database, though, and you don't necessarily want to go to the trouble of learning how databases work right away, you could use a sort of cloud-based system, like a solution that already exists. Something like Firebase is good. You'll have to learn how to sort of import that and use it in your project, but it's not particularly complicated. It does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So yeah, Firebase is a nice one for personal projects. But yeah, eventually you'll probably want to learn how SQL or SQL works. Learn relational databases as well, like MongoDB. That's a good one to use with Express as well, actually. There's a handy little dependency you can install called Mongoose, which allows you to sort of interface with MongoDB through Node. So that's quite nice. I quite like MongoDB as well because it's based on JavaScript objects. It's, the format it uses is JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. So if you're learning JavaScript, it's a good way to get stuck into databases as well. But you will eventually come across the traditional sort of relational database, which is SQL. Relational databases are much more scalable for large projects, for commercial projects, but a bit overkill, I find, for personal projects. But nonetheless, important to understand how that works, and more specifically, how database queries work. It's important to understand that, just purely to add to your understanding of how computers work and how much, you know, these sort of requests affect things like servers and APIs and things. What the impact is when you make a database query or any sort of API request, actually. APIs are important to understand as well at this point, I would say. So yeah, bit of back-end knowledge here. Once you go through that, I'd say at this point, you can go back to the front end a little bit and maybe start learning a framework. Before you jump into a framework, just to quickly mention as well that it is important to understand how HTTP works, especially if you're going to do full stack, making requests to APIs and stuff like that. HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, that is basically just how the internet works. You're going to want to know how the internet works before you work with it. So that's very important. Understanding what error codes mean, what HTTP codes mean, like your 200s, your 500s, and your various 400s as well. You're going to see them a lot, especially in the world of software development in the workplace. So yeah, HTTP is very important. But yeah, once you've got that, it shouldn't take too long to grasp the basics of it. But you know, it is quite deep as well. It can go quite deep. So just sort of manage your expectations of how well you understand that stuff. Just kind of dip your toes in and learn what the error codes are and stuff like that. Enough to help you understand when things go wrong in your own personal projects and things. How long that might be, how much that might be for you, it's hard to say, but definitely have a look at it anyway before you go building like full stack apps and things, because it is important to understand, at least somewhat. But yeah, once you've done that and you've maybe had a little go at building an app with a front and back end, maybe a good time to start using a framework. So you could rebuild that project or a different project using a framework instead of just vanilla JavaScript. This is more front end focused as well, so we're kind of going back to the front end again. You'll find that this is a little bit different, but if you understand JavaScript, if you've sort of if you've got the basics down and you know what's going on generally, then it will help when it comes to understanding how the frameworks work and what they're doing for you in the background. You don't necessarily see the kind of things that you don't have to do. You will see that rather than when people just jump into frameworks without learning vanilla JavaScript properly. There's a ton of things that these frameworks do that they won't necessarily understand what they're doing and how they're doing them, and suddenly when they try and write JavaScript in a way where they don't understand it, like in a different framework or just using vanilla JavaScript, they won't know how it works. They're just kind of used to how the framework works, if that makes sense. So it's good to understand what it's doing in the background, basically, is what I'm trying to say, before you try and dive into a framework. It will help you understand like how the framework actually works as well, because it can be a bit, let's say, intimidating to look at first, because there's quite a lot of stuff to learn. Let's take React, for example. React's one of the most popular commercially used JavaScript frameworks at the moment out there. You'll run across React. If you're going to be a JavaScript dev, you'll probably run into React at some point. So if you want to go with React for learn your first framework, I would say that's a good choice. Personally, I think Vue is a good one as well. Vue, I think a couple of things I like about it is I found it easier personally to get into. I don't know, I just think that the docs are nice and up to date. It's open source as well, so it's constantly been updated. And that means the docs are updated as well. I find the React docs are a bit lacking, to be honest. A lot of it's quite outdated and things. I think it's just a personal preference thing for the most part, but I just quite like Vue. It's not as popular commercially, but companies do use it. We use it where I work, for example. Don't use Angular. That's what I'm trying to say. Nah, I'm kidding. You could use Angular if you want, but it's less popular than the other two for various reasons. It's a bit strict and bloated, I would say, but it's a bit overkill again for small projects and things. But again, it's personal preference. So go with what you like the look of, but to make things easy, just maybe start with React. And you'll spend a while on that again, maybe a few months, just kind of understanding how that works and how to do the things that you would normally do, just using and utilizing the tools of the framework. But you want to build a few projects with that at this point. Once you've kind of got that down, try and build some different stuff. It's ultimately going to resemble a create, read, update, delete, or CRUD app at the end of the day, probably. But just try some different things out. Try something with APIs as well. Make sure you're using APIs. Companies like to see that because chances are you'll have to work with an API. At this point, it's just practice. There's other things you can learn, obviously, which I'll go into as well. But that is sort of the absolute basics. Like, you need to know that stuff. There's other things you can look at, which will help you a lot, especially for getting your first job. So yeah, I'll go into that next. So at this point, let's assume you've been through the basics. You've done your HTML, CSS, Git, command line, stuff like that. You've done your basic programming stuff, JavaScript or whatever language you've chosen. You've learned some back-end stuff, learned a few libraries like Node and Express, maybe done some database stuff, built a couple of projects, maybe one with a framework as well, like React or Vue, etc. And you've learned like HTTP and APIs and things like that. That's sort of most of your basics down. They're the absolute essentials, I think, for any dev, whether you're even looking to get a job or not. This is stuff you're all going to need. But for some extra stuff to make you sort of job ready, or just extra stuff in general to make you more appealing to companies and things, if that's the route you want to go. There's a couple of extra things you can do as a beginner to help you get a job. Start off with one that's not as technical, but is probably one of the most important for getting a job specifically, and that's learning sort of how Agile works and sort of project management tools like Jira, for example, Kanban boards, any software that deals with Kanban boards and how that works, how tickets work and epics work. That all falls under Agile, of course. If you don't know what that is, then definitely look that up, because that is probably the way of working that whatever company you join, if it's a tech company, will work. Sort of common practice these days. Not everyone uses it, but it's widely used by the industry now to work in a sort of Agile fashion. The most common implementation of Agile you'll hear is Scrum, but you quite regularly get the sort of hybrids of that. Where I work, for example, we don't strictly work in Scrum all the time. It just depends on whether it's like feature work or bug work and things like that. It also depends like the size of the company and stuff as well, and what way of working is more suitable to you, whether it's a sort of strict Scrum style or if it's more of just a basic Kanban sort of pulling work in as and when it's needed sort of thing. Look into that stuff. Having knowledge of it and how it works will help you get a job, basically, because it's arguably more important than actual coding ability, I would say, for working on a team in a sort of software-based company. Some other sort of front-end specific stuff, maybe not quite technical, but getting a bit more towards technical stuff again. A couple of things you might want to look into are like accessibility guidelines, sort of the common practice for accessibility, WCAG guidelines specifically, and also sort of basic UX design principles other than accessibility. UX design principles, accessibility sort of go hand in hand. And also sort of UX design tools as well, because you'll quite often be looking at designs for things if you're a front-end developer, or you might even be doing a bit of the designing yourself if you're sort of a hybrid front-end / designer. So tools like Figma and XD are very handy to know. And then going towards more the technical sort of developer stuff again, you'll probably want to look a bit more into things like unit testing, especially if you're going the back-end route, unit testing, test-driven development, and that kind of thing, writing tests, or if you're going to go the QA route as well, you might want to know how to do like automated tests and stuff. Testing's very widely used in companies, automated testing specifically, and sort of on-deployment testing and loads of different kinds of testing is it's all common practice now to try and sort of medicate bugs before they are released into production, and inevitably the user has to experience them. And there's always bugs and they will slip through, but this kind of stuff is just, it's more sort of barriers for bugs to have to pass through before it's released into production sort of thing. So automated testing and things like that and unit testing is widely used in companies now, and for front end and back end. Very commonly back end, but sometimes even front end as well. So it would be wise to pick up like a JavaScript testing library, for example. So yeah, look into that stuff. You can also look at server-side rendering. You could look at client-side rendering and server-side rendering. At the moment, if you've been using just React or Vue, like just out the box, how it comes, they use client-side rendering, which basically means it uses the DOM to sort of dynamically change content on the page. But server-side rendering does it sort of server-side as it suggests, not client-side on the browser. There's a few advantages to that, and I would recommend looking into that as well, because a lot of companies are going to start going the server-side route, I feel. And speaking of server-side as well, you might want to look into content management systems. They're also very common. We use one at my place of work as well. At my company, we use a content management system. WordPress as well is still like one of the most common content management systems used on websites now. It's like 70% of the web or something ridiculous like that still. Even just learn a little bit of PHP or something to learn how WordPress works is very valuable. Your first job might even be like a WordPress job, just because of the kind of, I don't want to say low barrier to entry, but like I feel like a lot of people who have like a few years experience probably tend to stay clear of like WordPress and things like that at that point. Which is, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And my first job was working quite heavily with WordPress. A lot of agencies and stuff will use it still because of how quickly and easily you can spin up a website and give customers sort of their own way of customizing their content and things like that. It's widely known by the general public as well. It's kind of a household name at this point. So you might come across it. So what I'm trying to get at is don't dismiss it. It's definitely still popular and a useful tool. So WordPress is a good one to look at. But any other sort of content management system, like headless content management systems, are becoming quite popular now as well. So something like Strapi uses Node as well. Something like Strapi might be good for, say, if you've learned JavaScript. Maybe a good one to look at. There's a few others as well, but generally the point is, content management systems are quite often used in companies and things. So yeah, go look at them. And other than that, you could learn other languages, you could learn other frameworks. Ultimately, what you want to do is try and learn the things that, if you're trying to get a job, like a company will want you to know. Have a look around the job ads and things, see what they're looking for. You'll find that the vast majority of the requirements aren't actually for like languages and frameworks and things. They'll be there, but there'll be a bunch of other things that you might have never seen before. For example, one thing I didn't touch on as well was like cloud-based services and things. If you want to learn like AWS or Azure as well, that can be a minefield. That's a whole, DevOps is a whole it's a whole job in itself a lot of times, and deployment pipelines and things is also very important to know. So there's a ton of other things you can learn is what I'm getting at. The point is, the bare basics that you need to know are here in this video. There's a bunch of extra stuff you could learn, but ultimately you want a roadmap, obviously, to try and get an idea of how to start. There's so much stuff out there you can learn, and so much stuff is useful that it can appear a bit overwhelming as a beginner to see all this stuff that you need to know. And I personally was a bit overwhelmed by it, but hopefully this video is giving you a bit of an idea of the kind of stuff you absolutely need to know, and sort of some of the other things that are important to know, especially if you're getting a job, but maybe aren't as important to know otherwise. And yeah, everything else is kind of just extra, and you will learn with experience the things you need to know, and it will eventually fall into place if you stick at it. But just start with the basics that I've mentioned here. The language, the framework, APIs, HTTP, HTML, CSS, Git, all that stuff. Once you've got all that down, things will just start to fall into place after that. So anyway, that's it for this one. If you enjoyed it, if you got any questions for me, then leave a comment. But otherwise, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.